What I really want to try and talk about today is what was happening in this particular area, because I think many of you will be familiar with the story of the Wars of Independence and Robert Bruce and William Wallace and the usual stuff. I want to do a slightly different slant on that. And the reason why I want to do that is because had you been able to go back in your TARDIS and talk to people way back in 1296, they would have given you a very different story. They would not have been giving you the story that we read about today. There's that tale that the victors write the history, and I'm kind of arguing a little bit that that's what we're looking at here. So I'm not going to give an alternative view, but I want to focus on the fact that in this area, Stuart Tree, Glenkens, people didn't always see it in the way that much of the rest of the country did. So what was going on? Now, there's no area that had more action, if that's the right word, than right here in the southwest during that period of time. And quite astonishing, armies 13 times, several full-scale major invasions. Difficult at that particular time to decide what was a battle and what was an incursion, but there was a lot of very serious skirmishes and harrying, and at least 30 that we can count in the area. So something was happening in this area. And what I want to kind of explore a little bit this afternoon is, was it as much a civil war as a war between Scotland and England? To do that, I've got to go back a bit. So excuse me, I'm not going to talk in great detail about areas around the Wars of Independence or Robert Bruce, etc. I really want to focus on this area particularly. So I suppose we've got to go right back to the 11th century. If you are looking at Scotland and what we now call Scotland, that was a different place in the 11th century. Galloway was a different place. It didn't really exist. And the first person who we can identify who started to give an element of unity was Fergus. Who was he? Well, there's all sorts of theories about it. For example, you might see there, he may well have been related to the English royal family. Some people argue that he was related to a fellow called Somerled, who was the progenitor of the MacDonalds and MacDougals up in the northwest and the great Highland clans. We don't know. We're not sure about any of that. What we do know is this particular chap got an element of unity across the southwest. And what we're looking at really is Ayrshire, particularly southern Ayrshire, and over to Galloway, almost up to the Nith. So quite an extensive area that he was looking at. Now, Scotland the boundaries of Scotland were hazy. And I think the area that Fergus was overlooking was semi-independent. Fergus would have quite liked it to be a lot more independent. And David I of Scotland wasn't too keen on that idea. But it was, I think, an uneasy relationship between Scotland, which was really focusing more on the area in what we think of as central Scotland and Fife, Scotia, Northern England, of course, and this area. And so there was quite a lot of problems. It ultimately ended up, I'll not bore you with all the details of what was going on, but it ended up with a couple of invasions, Scottish invasions of this area. And ultimately Fergus was banished. His banishment wasn't that bad. He was sent to Holyrood Abbey to become a monk. So that's where he spent his remaining years. But it did help to establish control of Scotland over this particular area. I'm not going to go in great detail about family trees, but this bit is important because I will keep coming back to it. This slide does come up again. So if I can just very quickly mention one or two bits and pieces. Fergus, for the sake of our discussion this afternoon, had two sons. One was called Uchtred and the other was called Gilbert. His daughter was Africa, but she is going to not appear too much in our conversation. So we got the two sons there. Uchtred's son was known as Roland, became Lachlan in the Gaelic, and Gilbert's son Duncan, and then Neil. Uchtred's son Alan, and that brings us right the way down from Alan to Dervagilla of Galloway, who is someone I'm sure you're familiar with. When we go down the other line, the Gilbert line, we've got Duncan, Neil, and then we come to Marjorie, who married Robert Bruce. Great story about that one, which I'll tell you later. And that's where the Robert Bruce bits come in. So on the one hand, we've got the Dare of Agilla side at the left. The other side, we've got Robert Bruce. So some of these names I will be coming back to later on. So Fergus is off to his monastery now in Holyrood. And what then happened was his two sons, Uchtred and Gilbert, were given joint control over this quasi-independent kingdom of Galloway. And it seemed to go okay for a while until quite an important year, 1174. And in 1174, Scotland launched an invasion of England, northern England. And during the process, William the Lion, King William the Lion of Scotland, was captured. Uchtred and Gilbert, who may well have been at the battle, but were certainly supportive of William, came back here and then immediately fell out. And it became a pretty serious falling out. So bad, in fact, that they couldn't live with each other. And ultimately what it led to was the murder of Uchtred by Gilbert. He didn't personally do it. I think it was probably his son. But Uchtred was fairly brutally murdered. Well, actually, what happened was, he wasn't murdered as such. They decided they would cut out his tongue. They would cut off his hands, cut off his testicles. So basically, not surprising he died after all that. But basically what it meant, of course, he couldn't speak to anyone, he couldn't go anywhere, and he couldn't reproduce. And that was, in a way, they said, right, we're going to take the line from now on. You're out of it, boy. So Uchtred didn't come out of it too well, but Gilbert did. Now, what was this all about? Well, it seems to be about people moving into the area. And I'd mentioned about the connections with England. And bear in mind, this whole idea of nationality is a bit hazy at this time. But a lot of Normans were moving into the area. And Uchtred seemed to welcome the Normans, particularly in the eastern part of our area. Gilbert was much more suspicious. I should point out that, of course, we're talking about a very Gallic society here. Even Uchtred, his first language would have been Gaelic, and Gilbert most definitely so. And they were not too happy about the so-called incomers. And this seemed to reach a head with ultimately Gilbert saying, right, okay, let's get rid of Uchtred and re-establish the Gallic kingdom. Let's expel all the foreigners and get rid of them all. Now, not surprising when that happened, Roland Lachlan, the son of Gilbert, of Uchtred, was not very happy about this. So we have civil war. Civil war was going on in the area. And there's an amazing statue, if you go to Dundrennan, which may well date from this particular period. And it shows a monk. And if the first glance, you've got a monk, which is the normal statue. When you look very closely, you see he's got a sword. And the sword is either his sword or it's a sword in him. We're not too sure about that. And at his feet is a baby, a dead baby. And it may well be the sort of internal turmoil. Certainly Richard Oram thought this was that demonstrating of the turmoil that was going on in this particular area. So, how could we put a stop to that? The Scottish kings were getting involved in this. The English kings were getting involved in this. So ultimately, a kind of peace agreement came forward. The idea being that Gilbert, and ultimately he died shortly after this, and Duncan took over, would be given control of what we now call Carrick, southern Ayrshire, whereas Lachlan, Roland, would be given the southern part we now think of as Galloway. So the area was kind of partitioned. And one of the interesting things was, whilst there was most certainly a lot of problems going on, was it a feud? Was it a long-running feud? Was this maybe an origin of a dispute between Carrick and Galloway, which could carry on into the future? There's very little evidence that they carried on the fight themselves, but they were most definitely not the best of pals. And Carrick and Galloway did tend to go their own way for much of the time there as well. We'll move down the line, and looking at Galloway now, Roland's son was a man called Alan of Galloway, who was an astonishing figure. Alan was possibly one of the the strongest warlords of medieval Scotland, could control a huge fleet. He was the person, when the Vikings were threatening Galloway, turned around and said, well, look, we can get to Norway as easy as you can get to us, you know, watch it. And they did. He was a fearsome character. He was also very close to King John of England, and was at the Magna Carta, the signing of the Magna Carta, apparently as a sort of side support of King John himself, which didn't harm him too much because he got given huge lands in Northern Ireland. So Alan of Galloway became a very powerful figure, and he had 3 daughters, one of whom was Dervagilla, and we'll come back to Dervagilla later on. Moving down the other line now, so you can see the left-hand side, we've very quickly gone down Uchtred, and we've gone down Lochlin, and we've ended up with Alan. On the other side now, we've got Gilbert, who died shortly after these events, and Duncan took over. His son was there for a very short period of time, and then he had a daughter, Marjorie. Excuse me putting the specs on, I can see my own light writing a bit better. Now, Marjorie was an interesting character. She was married first to a man whose name was, I think it was Gordon of Kilconquhar, I forget which, but anyway, he was killed on a crusade. And she came back, and Robert Bruce, not the famous Robert Bruce, but Robert Bruce's father, happened to be wandering in the area, and so the story goes, he took a shine to her. And she took an even bigger shine to him, so much so that she captured him and took him back to Turnberry Castle and said, I'm not letting you out until you marry me. And so, despite the fact that in those days they should have got the king's permission, they didn't, but they did get married, and they stayed married. And it's a great story. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but Marjorie was quite a character. And that is how Robert Bruce got involved in the area. The Bruces, if I can very briefly come to that, had been given way back in the early 12th century, huge area of Annandale. So they were east of Dumfries. They occupied much of that. Once Robert Bruce VI, I've given them the numbers because they're all called Robert Bruce, so that's why the numbers are there. Once he married Marjorie, then he inherited, through Marjorie, the Carrick earldom. So now we've got the Bruces in control of the east, Annandale, and the northwest, Carrick. And right in the middle, you've got Alan of Galloway, and of course, ultimately, the daughter, Dervagilla. Was there a major feud going on? Again, there's not massive evidence to suggest there was a feud. Not best of pals, even though on occasions Robert Bruce, the 5th and 6th, did ally with Balliol. They did seem to have an uneasy peace between them all. Move on a little bit about Dervagilla. I'm sure you know a little bit about Dervagilla. And Dervagilla, of course, married into a good family. She was a very rich woman in her own right. She owned the Morville estates, which is the whole of Lauderdale, parts of the borders, as well as Galloway. When she married this fella here, John Balliol, at the right-hand side, she inherited large areas of northern England, Barnard Castle, of course, being the centre, and really the Balliols were perhaps the leading figures in northern England in terms of support for the king. So we've got a kind of strange cross-border thing going on here. So let's jump now to 1286. And briefly, this is what happened in our area. I'm going to go through these and talk a little bit more about them, but I want to begin in 1286 with a civil war. And I'm going to mention some places in case I'm sure you're all familiar with these places, but I just stuck them on a wee map because I will talk a little bit more about them. And we've got at the top left there Turnberry, which is the headquarters of the Bruce, where Robert Bruce may have been born, and certainly spent a lot of his time. And the Earl of Carrick would have been based there. Lochdoon Castle, which was a border castle, very much the border between the Galloway area, controlled of course by Balliols now, and the northern area, which was controlled by the Bruces. So Loch Doon, significant castle. Moving down the way, down into Loch Kens, not too far from us, we come to Burnt Island. Not enough is made of Burnt Island. We're not even absolutely certain where it is. Some old maps do illustrate an island, not in the Kent, sort of really on an island just off where Crossmichael is. They could really do with a lot of work on this to find out exactly where it was, but it was important. And further south we have Threave. If we move a little bit northeast of Threave, we have the castle of Bittle. And Bittle, of course, was the headquarters of, by this particular stage, Devergilla, and may well have been an important site for Alan. I confess an interest at this particular stage because we're now developing a fairly major project to try and do a dig in Bittle, which will be a community dig, to just establish the site of this. Bittle was the largest Mount and Bailey castle in Scotland by a significant portion. It was the home of 2 Scottish kings. It was the birthplace of Balliol College, Oxford, and has a really significant central role in Scottish history. But it's been written out of Scottish history for reasons which will become apparent. So we're trying to redress the balance a bit, and we're going to be putting interpretation boards up, and hopefully we can get a dig going. But what we're trying to do is demonstrate this other side to what was going on. So we've got a question mark. We've got what appears to be a split, possibly a long-running split between Carrick and Galloway. An uneasy peace, I think you might call it. One being Bruce and the other side being Balliol. That was all right. I'm just running through some of the sites. Cruggleton, major castle in the southwest. Burnt Island, we're not absolutely certain, as I said, where it was. Townbury, just south of Ayr. And a lovely nice map. And you can see Loch Doon and Loch Doon Castle down at the south there. Loch Doon Castle was on an island in the loch, and when the hydroelectric power scheme came along, they took it, as I'm sure you're probably aware, stone by stone and rebuilt it on the shore. So you could still go and see Loch Doon Castle, but it's not at its original site. That's where it was, and that's where it now is. And there we have Threave. Threave didn't exist as it seems to exist there during the period we're talking about. It was built later, but there may well have been a Mount and Bailey castle in its place. And there's Bittle. Hardly anything left of the thing there. Oh, sorry. You've got the mound you can see, which is the central headquarters. And surrounding it was the Bailey, but really precious little we can see about it. We then start to look in terms of Scotland. Can I say a little bit about allegiance? We've got a time machine, we've got a TARDIS, and we're talking to people in where New Galloway is, or where Dalbeattie is, or Castle Douglas, etc., at that time, and said, right, how would you describe yourself? Very few of them would have described themselves as Scottish. But even so, they might well be aware that Scotland exists, and they had some element of allegiance to Scotland. So where did that allegiance lie? Well, was this allegiance to Galloway? Well, there was certainly an allegiance to Galloway, especially after the murder of Uhtred, which really helped to bring Galloway together. But I think the answer you'd most likely get would be there'd been allegiance to not the feudal lord, but to their kinship group. And in those days, we talked quite a lot about kinship groups. And I did a research project which won a prize, amazingly enough, on kinship groups in the southwest. And in the southwest, a number developed. When we look at Carrick, the Kennedys were almost certainly something called King Kjell, the head of the Kinaldi being the sort of kinship area. And the Kennedys were definitely the head of that one. So if you like, the chief of the clan, for lack of a better word. Southwest, it was McDowell. The McDowells were the preeminent ones. Good old Stafford played for Scotland, doing a grand job, isn't he? So the McDowells haven't disappeared yet from Galloway. And others, McCulloch's being one of them, were also pretty important in that area. So kinship groups played a part, and many people would have had allegiance to those kinship groups. And so the feudal lord would have to get the support of the kinship group to really be effective. And that became very important in the southwest, and sometimes led to allegiances which you wouldn't have expected. So in 1286, who's the boss? Who's in charge? Well, we've shown the yellow carrot. We've got the Galloway split coming up there. And then when we get across into Dumfries and east, we've got kind of mixed Bruce. I've said Comyn there, but Comyn was closely allied to Balliol. Mixed alliances in that particular area. And then we had catastrophe in Scotland. Alexander III fell off his horse and was killed, King Horn. His daughter, who was the Maid of Norway next in line, she also died. And so we were left with a time when we just weren't very sure who was going to become king. Almost all the claimants, the obvious claimants, had died. And so one or two people thought, well, I'd better kind of make myself prominent, especially Robert Bruce. Now, I should point out, we're talking about Robert Bruce, grandfather. And he thought that he was in line for the Scottish throne, and he wanted to make damn sure that everybody knew about it. The Comyns were allied to the Balliols, and the Balliols were also strongly in line for the Scottish throne. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. And so what happened was, Bruce, in 1286, when nobody was too sure, thought he would manage to get his retaliation in first. So he launched an attack. And he launched an attack on Bittle Castle and much of the southwest of Scotland. He made a chap called Patrick McCulloch, who was the custodian of Balliol Castle at that time, to read this proclamation, basically saying, let's get rid of all these damn foreigners, especially these Balliol people, because the Bruces, they're the ones for Scotland, etc. He didn't put it in those words. We don't actually know 100% what he said, but it was something on those lines. And you might say, okay, this is Bruce reminding everybody that he was there. Unfortunately, it was also accompanied by wastage of much of the southwest. This area we're in now was wasted. The Balliol, the Bittle area around Dalbeattie was wasted. The Castle Douglas area was wasted. It was a pretty serious incursion. It wasn't just an overnight thing. It was pretty serious. And this all happened at Bittle Castle in 1286. Nothing really happened after that, but there was trouble brewing, quite clearly. And so in Scotland, they thought, right, how are we going to sort out who's going to become next in line for king? So this is where perhaps we made our biggest mistake, because we said to this fella at the right-hand side, Edward I of England, will you come across and you can be the judge and jury of this one, and what we'll do is we'll get everybody to present their case to you, and you can decide who's going to become king, because we need a bit of extra help from outside. So Edward, rubbing his hands in glee, said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. That's an amazing picture, isn't it? Robert Bruce, that's the recreation of the face of Robert Bruce from extant bones. Look at those eyes, they're not ticking, he's got his eyes on us all. So whether he looked like that, well, you know, certainly the reconstruction seems to suggest he might have done. But the two leading claimants were Robert Bruce, grandfather, and John Balliol. And Edward I decided that the claimant to the throne was John Balliol. Bruces were hopping mad about this. They were not happy at all. And so from 1292, John Balliol became King John Balliol. He was crowned at Scone, of course, but nevertheless was based in Bittle and spent a fair bit of time in the area we're now in here. Things didn't go well for him. There were all sorts of issues. These can be incredibly boring, can't they? But it might just help to clarify in your mind just what was going on. So all this Bruce and Balliol stuff. If we come down, we'll see David I. Move down and you'll see we're split up into four. We've got Malcolm IV, top left, then William, two kings of Scotland, brothers. Then we've got Ada, And then we've got the youngest one of the lot, David, Earl of Huntingdon. Well, Malcolm IV had no heirs. William did, who became Alexander II, and then Alexander III. And as we mentioned, Alexander III fell off his horse, fell down a cliff in Kinghorn in Fife, and so that was the end of him. The only other possible claimant, and you might notice that the children of Alexander III had all predeceased him, was Margaret. And Margaret was married to the Earl of Norway, and their daughter was called the Maid of Norway, and she was brought over as a possible queen, but she died en route. So with no claimant, that whole left-hand side is gone. So you've got to look to the right-hand side. So when we look to the right-hand side, and we come way back to the wee brother, David, Earl of Huntingdon at the top, and he had two daughters. One was called Margaret, the elder one. Isabel was the younger one. And Margaret married Alan of Galloway. You remember the guy, Alan of Galloway? So that's where our connection comes to the Scottish throne. And their daughter, had three daughters, but Dervagilla ultimately was the only one, was the one who married John Balliol. So that's the connection to the throne of Scotland that we have there. On the other side, Isabel, the younger daughter, her daughter had married Robert Bruce's grandfather. And that, of course, you remember, is Marjorie. And then we come down to Robert Bruce's father, who died in 1304, and ultimately Robert Bruce himself. So it was nip and tuck who was going to become the king. But Edward I decided that John Balliol was the man. So I hope that clarifies some of all these names. John Balliol's reign was unfortunate. He was only there for 4 years. And Edward I did absolutely everything he could to undermine John Balliol. Any appeals that went, he insisted that the appeals came to him. He insisted that he was the overlord of Scotland and John Balliol could only be king on his behalf. And the Scottish nobles got a bit fed up of this. So they decided that this couldn't go on. John Balliol has been written out of history. We were briefly talking about this before the lecture. And he got this nickname Tomb Tabard, which means empty tabard. There he is. And that's the end of John Balliol. His sceptre has been broken in two. The tabard that he's wearing has got no insignia left on it. He seems to have left his trousers at home. And he's an empty king. He's not in a very good condition, the ex-king. Well, actually what caused it was that Balliol and the Scottish nobles had had enough. So they had an alliance with France. And Edward I, by this stage, who had already decided that he wanted overlordship of Scotland, said, right, I'm not having this. So he then invaded Scotland. So it was this alliance with France. That was the old alliance, the beginning of it. It was that led ultimately to King Edward invading Scotland. He was successful. John Balliol was deposed. And then the Wars of Independence began in earnest. It's not the purpose of this talk to go all the way through the Wars of Independence because I could be here until 12 o'clock at night. So I'm really only going to focus on the bits that affect us. But this area, you remember, was questionable in terms of its loyalty to Scotland. In actual fact, in the early days, John Balliol and the supporters of John Balliol were very firmly in the Scottish side against King Edward. We should also be pointed out that William Wallace fought not for Bruce or anybody else, but he fought for Balliol. So he himself thought that Balliol was the rightful king of Scotland. Even Robert Bruce himself, in the early stages, accepted that Balliol was the rightful king. Didn't last long, though. Robert Bruce vacillated a lot. And you can see at this particular stage then that the southwest had got a bit of a problem. There were still the vestiges of support for Balliol, so it stayed as a Balliol area. Now this is where I come back to the kinship groups again. You know, maybe they weren't particularly keen on Balliol and his connections to northern England, but they certainly were in terms of Alan of Galloway and his daughter Dervagilla. And that was a very ancient and very strong connection too. Edward, I mean, that's just one example. Edward launched a full-scale invasion not long after Wallace and Stirling Bridge into this area. Calaverock, of course, was besieged, and you can see it went right the way over our area and came back again. They did end up with a truce. Ultimately then, this area was devastated, and it's an old story. The nip and tuck, people coming, people going, the poor people were the ones that suffered. But this loyalty towards Balliol continued. And you've got, I should mention just very briefly sources, because sources are really difficult here. Because almost all the Scottish sources were destroyed, we rely on English sources. We have a few of those that were contemporary. The Scottish sources were all written between 80 and 100 years after the event. They may well have been taken from people who were here and heard stories about it, but with very, very few contemporary Scottish sources. So we do rely a lot on English sources at the particular time. But Hugh de Champagne, who was an English nobleman, and he had been given quite a lot of land in our area, and he wanted some money back, 1306. And he says, I want it back, not the value they were before the Scottish War, because they've been totally wasted. So he was only wanting relief for his lands on the present value, which was tiny, because there'd been so much destruction in the area. 1306 was the fateful day, fateful year when Robert Bruce finally decided that he wanted to have a more proactive role in Scotland, and he murdered John Comyn in Dumfries. He then legged it as quick as he possibly could up to Scone, and he was then crowned as Scottish king. Now you can imagine that this area was questionable about this, still strong Balliol and Comyn support in this area. But nevertheless, it was a bit piecemeal. The English, of course, were furious about the whole thing because they had occupied Scotland. They thought it was relatively quiet. They thought they had Scottish under control until Bruce murdered Comyn. And so very shortly after Robert Bruce crowned himself king, he was challenged to battle, and he lost and was then kind of chased across the west of Scotland and disappeared from history. Recent research tends to suggest that almost certainly he was in Ireland, probably Rathlin Island in Ireland. And from there he was able to decide what he was going to do. What he decided to do was to come back to Scotland, and he split his forces. Very interesting this, I'm writing a paper on this at the moment. He split his forces, which was a kind of peculiar thing to do because he didn't have many forces anyway. One lot landed in Loch Ryan, and the other lot, with Robert Bruce himself, landed near Turnberry. Now, Loch Ryan, which had two of his brothers leading, his younger brothers, were leading the campaign, as well as a significant number of Irish mercenaries and a lot of his supporters, were ambushed. When they landed, they were very quickly attacked and totally defeated. And it was MacDowell and the kingship of Galloway, they were waiting for him. They kind of got wind of this. His two brothers were then taken away to Dumfries, both executed, as indeed were several others. So Loch Ryan was a total disaster. So half of Robert Bruce's re-invasion of Scotland was a complete disaster. It was almost a disaster for the invasion himself. When he landed at Turnberry, he had one or two very minor successes, but very quickly he had to run for it, and that's where we hear the stories of him being in the Galloway Hills and flitting around the place and being chased by dogs and all sorts of things. And we have a lot of mythology associated with that. We certainly know that he had an encampment in Glentrool, and there was one, possibly two. I think a battle is stretching it a bit. The English report as the loss of several horses. They didn't mention loss of people, they mentioned losing several horses. So it wasn't a big battle. But what Robert Bruce had, and this is quite important to the rest of the story, is he seemed to have a very, very efficient system of spin. He had his spin men around the place. And so he managed to spin out Loch Truel and the Battle of Loch Truel into a major victory. And so the word was getting around that, hey, maybe this Robert Bruce has got victory on his side. He even managed to find some old, I'm trying to think of the name of the person that did it. So it's some very old sayings that Bruce is going to come back and save Scotland, etc. So support for Bruce started to arise. And they always say that, you know, before Glentrool, Robert Bruce never won a battle. After Glentrool, he never lost one. And there's an element of truth in that, because he moved his forces then up to Loudon Hill. Not a huge force, but he took on a significant English force and won. And at that stage, the Bruce star was in ascendancy. He'd only got one brother left by this stage, who was Edward. And so one of the things they had to do was to try and consolidate Scotland. The northeast was a bit dodgy because that was the common heartland. But the place that was very, very dodgy was, of course, the southwest, us. Because the Balliol common support was still there. And Bruce knew that the only way he was going to get effective control of Scotland was to make sure he could bring the southwest, our area, under effective control itself. He, first of all, left it to his brother, Edward. And Edward launched a whole series of absolutely vicious attacks on the area. And there were a number of fairly major skirmishes. The Battle of the Cree, it was won at the left-hand side there as well. But gradually, bit by bit, Edward, with a bit of help from Robert as well, moved eastwards, taking Galloway as it went, until the last bastion was Bittle Castle. We've called it the Airship because this area was effectively destroyed. The only place really left was Bittle and the immediately surrounding area. The rest of the area was almost completely devastated. So between 1308, 1309, right up to 1314, we said the castles fall. All the castles that were in the hands of England or in the hands of the Balliols were gradually going one by one. And Bittle was one of the last to fall. Loch Doon, I'm not mentioning that because that's not that far from us. And remember, that was the kind of border castle between Carrick and Galloway. Loch Doon was held by Bruce's brother-in-law, Christopher Seaton. And it may be that when Bruce split his forces, he was moving in a sort of pincer movement to try and take that castle. It may well be. He failed because obviously Loch Ryan failed, and the English took it back. They got hold of Christopher Seaton, and he was then taken to Dumfries, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered. So we all know what happened to Wallace, the terrible death of Wallace. Christopher Seaton had exactly the same in Dumfries. So that was now in English hands. So again, one of the things Edward had got to do, take control of Loch Doon, which one by one he did. And so by 1314, Bittle finally fell, semi-destroyed, not totally, and the Battle of Bannockburn then established Robert Bruce as king of a united Scotland. Okay, so now we've got Scotland independent, the English have lost, everybody's happy. In fact, it wasn't quite true. There was actually a lot of internal opposition to Bruce, and this is something that is kind of written out of history. The Declaration of Arbroath is something I'm sure you're all familiar with. All great stuff, you know, as long as but 100 of us remain, we'll never be brought under English rule, good stirring stuff, etc. And that was written in 1320. Bruce was firmly in control of Scotland, but what it doesn't mention is that very same year was something I put at the right-hand side there called the Souls Conspiracy. And it's actually quite difficult to get information about that. A lot of historians are trying to bring this into a bit more prominence. But Robert Bruce got wind of a fairly major conspiracy against him from Lord Souls. Quite how widespread the conspiracy is, we're not sure. Certainly Maxwell of Calaverock seemed to be implicated in it. And of course, the people of Galloway, as always. So what we've got is a significant uprising against Robert Bruce. It was brutally suppressed. was something called the Black Parliament, where all the leaders and the people they knew about involved in this conspiracy were executed fairly brutally. And that did appear to quieten people down for a wee while. Things got a little bit better. So is that the end of the story? Are we now looking at a position where Bruce has finally quelled opposition and hopefully he can come back to Galloway and everything's going to be fine? Bruce is firmly in control. Unfortunately for Bruce anyway, not. Because Bruce died in 1329, his son, David, became David II, but he was a wee boy. And what Robert Bruce had done, not unsurprisingly, is he had rewarded the people who supported him with land primarily. And of course, the people who didn't support him lost their land. And they were called the dispossessed. And many of them ended up going to England. But they felt very, very hard done by. They'd lost all the lands. And so there was a large group of people who were very unhappy about what had gone on. John Balliol had been captured, remember, and dethroned. He was captured and kept kidnapped in the Tower of London for quite a long time. But finally he was taken to France. There was a lot of efforts to try and bring him back to Scotland, and there was still support. Needless to say, Robert Bruce was not going to support that. But he had a son, and the son was called Edward. And Edward stayed down in England, and effectively much of his childhood was brought up in England. And no doubt there's a little bit of mind-bending going on, but he became the titular head of the dispossessed, because he was dispossessed. He thought he was rightfully the King of Scotland. He should have taken over from his father John. So he was dispossessed, and so were several others. We mentioned some of the names: Comyn, Beaumont, Mowbray, the Earl of Athol, Umfraville. They're names that are so important in the Wars of Independence, and they were all among the dispossessed. So we move in, and this is an interesting one. This is a statement from this person called Twynham Lauriston. Now, nobody really knows whether this fellow existed. He may not have existed. He may well have been a compound of several people, and he may well be named simply because there was an estate of Twynham and an estate of Lauriston, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, not a million miles from where we are at the moment. And he's speaking to Edward Balliol and said, now's the time. Go back, because you've got Robert Bruce, who occupied the kingdom's dead. His son's just a boy. Thomas Randolph, the right-hand man, tough guy, who was the great leader of Robert Bruce, has gone. James Douglas, another great leader, he's gone out for the Holy Land. So all the big leaders, the big war leaders of Scotland are gone. So Edward, now's your chance. Come back, you're going to get lots of support. Hurry and get started, be of good heart. Take up arms. So that's exactly what he did. So Edward Balliol then, and we thought all this was ended, he then re-invaded Scotland with these dispossessed. And he moved on Perth. He wanted to get crowned at Scone. So he moved on Perth, and a battle called Duplin Moor took place. It wasn't a big force that he brought with him. Unfortunately, the Scots force that went to meet him were hopelessly disorganized, terribly badly led, and was slaughtered. It was a dreadful, dreadful defeat for the Scots. And, you know, we have reports that the dead who were piled into big mounds, 15 feet high, of the dead of the Scots. A terrible defeat for Scotland. And so what did Edward Balliol do? Well, of course, he went to Scone, and he was then crowned as King of Scotland. So we've now got Edward, he's back, and he can start now to consolidate his kingdom. This is just a quote at the time. All men said it was God's hand and not man's hand, for the Scots were so many, and the English and the dispossessed were so few. So Edward, King of Scotland now, he needed to get back and consolidate his kingdom. So of course he came back to the southwest. He came back to Bittle and this particular area. And then he was then reported round about New Year's time in Annan. And he was ambushed in Annan. And the whole thing takes on almost a farce. because he had to run away, kind of almost in the middle of the night. And he said, on a sorry jade with neither bridle nor saddle. He needed to jump on his horse, in other words. Didn't even have time to saddle it up. One shank booted, only one boot on his foot, and the other was bare. So you get an idea of the panic that must have gone. Very nearly was Edward Balliol captured at that particular moment. And he had to run for his life. So Edward, as King of Scotland, in June 1332, by December 1332, he was back in England. And he wasn't at all sure where he was going to go from here. But that wasn't the end, because Edward, of course, wanted to get back. And he still had friends. He still had the dispossessed. And he still had the support of the people of this area. So he decided to launch another invasion. The problem was he didn't have enough men to do it. So he needed to enlist the support of the English king. And that perhaps was his strength, but also, without a doubt, his downfall. I'll come on to what he had to promise the English king to get that support. Do you know, so much of this reminds you, when you think about it, of what's been going on in Ukraine with Russia and the United States of America. So many parallels in all this. But the Battle of Halidon Hill, Balliol won with the English support and seemed then to be establishing some control over Scotland. This is from the Chronicle of Winton. This was written 80 years after the event, and it's in Old Scots, and you can see the translation underneath. So thus the Kingdom of Scotland was completely in Englishmen hands, even though Edward Balliol wouldn't have regarded himself in that light. No one then dared oppose them, because such great harm did they cause. So why did Edward do this? Well, the only way he could guarantee getting back to what he considered his rightful place, King of Scotland, was by getting the support of England. And to do that, he needed to recognize Edward as his feudal superior. Just exactly what Edward III's grandfather said, Edward I. He said, right, come on, I'm the boss of Scotland, make me your feudal superior and we're going to be okay. And we said no. Well, this time Edward said yes. As a result of that, Edward had to promise to use Scottish forces to help Edward. But number 3 was perhaps the big one, because he had to then give up a lot of land. Again, look at the parallels, the Donbass. But in our particular case, the whole of southeastern Scotland. The whole of southeastern Scotland, right the way up to the Nith, was given over to Edward. And they're to be separated from Scotland. So you're going almost from Edinburgh right the way down to the Nith, and everywhere south and east of that was then handed over to England and was going to be annexed to the English crown forever. So he was giving a lot of land away. That did not make him very popular with the Scots. However, he still had his heartland, and his heartland was Balliol, was Bittle. What we've then got is a confusing time in Scottish history. So that was in 1333. 1334-35, we've got Edward re-established himself as king. But from there on, we've really got a fairly major civil war. I had mentioned David, Robert Bruce's son, and David was a wee boy, and he was taken away and was taken away to France for his own safety. When it was safe, he was brought back. And so the supporters of David, who of course is the Robert Bruce line, had one king. Edward III had got control of much of southeastern Scotland. He was the second king. And the third king was Edward Balliol, whose only real area of being the king was right here. He could still be king in what we now think of as the Stuart tree. That was his area. And so we have a series of effectively guerrilla warfare. And that went on for a long time. We've got a number of quotes. And I just thought I'd put some of these quotes up. They're mainly from English sources. A lot are from Lanercost. Lanercost Priory, you may be familiar with, is just over the border in England. And they kept a running diary. So it's the nearest we've got to a contemporary account of what was going on in Scotland. And they weren't that far away. Obviously written from an English point of view, but nevertheless near enough to get first-hand accounts. And you could see we really suffered. This area suffered terribly. completely destroyed, invaded and burnt Galloway. People had just had to run away. They destroyed the wretched Galwegians on this side of the Cree because they adhered so firmly to their Lord King Edward Balliol. So in a way, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, that this area, despite all the ups and downs, the wastage that Edward Bruce laid on the area, the attacks from Robert Bruce, and then, of course, the depredations afterwards, their support for Balliol never wavered. It was there all the time. My argument is it was really the support for the kinship areas, McDowell, McCulloch, McCann, rather than Balliol himself. But as long as Balliol could keep these people in his support, he was going to get the people. There's a few more. A devastating raid. Galloway natives slaughtered and put to fight. So anyway, King David, young David, came back when he was old enough, came back to Scotland, and he took the kingdom of Scotland for what it was worth, his bit. And so we've got three kings. We've got Edward III of England, we've got Edward Balliol of Scotland, and we've got King David of Scotland. King David then decided that he really wanted to get rid of, first of all, the English, and secondly, Edward himself. So he invaded England. Not really a very clever idea. It didn't help by the fact that when they got just over the border at Neville's Cross, half of his force went over to the other side. They deserted him. And so it became a complete disaster. So yet another major loss that we'd had. And that's 1346 now. David was captured. And he was captured by the English and now imprisoned in England. And the only way that Scotland were going to get him back was by paying massive tribute. So Edward looked like he was back in again because he was on the ropes with only that small area around Bittle and the Glenkens supporting him. And now it looked after Neville's Cross. He was back again. Everything was great. Unfortunately, that proved not to be the case. Heston Island was his retreat. If you're familiar with Heston Island at all, he built it's called a mansion house. It was really a fortified, it was a castle, effectively. And this was the place he thought he might be safe. So Heston Island is just off, you'll see it off Auchencairn and Kipford and that area there. See the wee lighthouse there. And he built his mansion house there. He was there some of the time, and then he moved over to Bittle Castle. And that was his heartland. But he had a third heartland, and that was Burnt Island. And even in the time when he was shaky in terms of a king of Scotland, he was still issuing proclamations, and he was still trying to establish law and order. And we have a number of documents that originated from Burnt Island. So we know that Glenkens was still at that stage very much in support of Edward. So that seemed to be the only heartland it got left. The guerrilla war was dodgy. He was clearly not doing very well. And perhaps the final nail in the coffin was in 1353 and stretching over into 1354. And William Douglas, who'd been a thorn in the flesh, and he was one of the great guerrilla leaders, he launched a really major attack. And effectively, he wrested control of pretty much the whole of Galloway, with the one exception of the area around Bittle, and probably Burnt Island and stations in between. He wrested control away from Edward. And Edward, by this stage then, thought, right, I've about had it. Was England going to come to his rescue? Was Edward III going to rescue him? Well, the answer was no, because a number of other things were happening at the time. Edward had launched an attack on France. It was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and he was rather more interested in the Battle of Crécy than he was in Scotland. David, King David, who had got imprisoned, the ransom was being paid, and he was no longer any use to him. He couldn't use him anymore. And to make matters worse, the Black Death was just kicking off, and disease was devastating. England particularly, but later on, of course, it moved into Scotland too. So at that stage, Edward III said, right, Scotland's really not central to all this. I'm not going to be too worried about this. So he withdrew his support from Edward. And so Edward Balliol at that stage gave up the ghost. He moved from Burnt Island and Heston to Balliol, to Bittle Castle, and from Bittle Castle he moved across country to Roxburgh, and there he resigned his kingdom, and he basically gave up all right to the throne. And that really is pretty much the end of the story. So where does it leave us? Well, what it leaves us with is with devastation. This particular area then, from 1286, when the trouble started on the courtyard of Bittle Castle, right the way through to Edward Balliol leaving us, this area had been almost continually under attack. And during the whole period of time, it had never lost faith with the Balliols, and in particular with the line of Dervagilla. Obviously, the fight was over. There was no longer any need to support it. Now, why do we not know very much about this? Well, you know, I started off kicking off about this, and I'll come back to it now, is, you know, history is written by the victors, and much of what happened in Galloway is written out of Scottish history. And so what you'll read about the great guerrilla fighters who re-established Scotland against English occupation. Absolutely true. And you'll read about Robert Bruce. Absolutely true. But the people of this area gave a different story. And Robert Bruce, to them, was not the hero at all. In fact, he was the villain. And at that stage, I think I'll probably finish.